Search crews are exhausted after searching all day.
Now, the sheriff says that they're treating this area as a crime scene.
Florida, the Coast Guard, equipped with 2 Air Force helicopters, continue to search Sunday for a fishing boat carrying a pair of NFL players.
Over 16 million viewers tune in, making it the most popular sport in America and one of the most popular in the world, creating some of the most known and revered athletes on the planet. However, even with so many eyes, some of the NFL's players would vanish.
Search crews are exhausted after searching all day for a former Grand Valley State football quarterback, Cullen Finnerty.
Search crews have found nothing except for Finnerty's one-man boat pulled up onto rocks at the bottom of these stairs. That was on Sunday. The sheriff says Finnerty got nervous about something on Sunday night, called his wife to say he was getting out of the river, and then disappeared.
He was afraid, that he ran into the woods because he was afraid.
Right.
What was he afraid of?
Journalist Ted Jackson telling the story of Jackie Wallace, the former U of A football star who's now missing. The Minnesota Vikings drafted him, and in 6 NFL seasons, he played in 2 Super Bowls. But it was after his football career, when the roar of crowds faded, that his demons took control.
The Coast Guard, equipped with 2 Air Force helicopters, continue to search Sunday for a fishing boat carrying a pair of NFL players.
Top story tonight, the continuing desperate efforts to save lives.
We begin with the search that continues.
An unimaginable horror. 2 college students held captive and tortured by masked men in what they assumed was a random attack.
Tied up, terrorized, and beaten for 40 hours, and the question remains, why?
There's a video. I'm recording.
He was disoriented. He didn't know where he was in the woods. He was afraid. I just knew when I spoke with him that something wasn't right.
Cullen Finnerty said he ran into 2 men on Baldwin River. He thought they might be following him. He was lost, confused, scared.
Senior quarterback Cullen Finnerty is looking to lead the Lakers to 3 national titles in 4 years. Tom Cleary reports now on one of the most exciting quarterbacks in the nation.
Game. Roll out to the right. They've got receivers going deep, wide open. It is caught for a touchdown. Terry Mitchell, a senior, his 8th TD of the year.
Upon enrolling in Grand Valley State University, Cullen Finnerty took the league by storm, beating teams through the air
Grand Valley to what may have been its greatest season ever, a 15-0 campaign
and on the ground. In Finnerty's tenure at Grand Valley State, he threw for over 10,000 yards and ran for over 2,000, won 3 national championships, and had a record of 51 wins and just 4 losses, becoming the winningest quarterback in college football history.
So he just had this mentality of kind of invincibility. We kind of all thought he was Superman.
The 2007 NFL Draft is now open.
Finnerty was signed to the Baltimore Ravens. However, unlike his college career, Finnerty's time in the NFL would be short and rocky. He would be released before the preseason began. Finnerty was then re-signed to the Ravens practice squad during the season, where he was promoted to the active roster for the final 2 games of the regular season. This would be the closest Finnerty would get to playing in an NFL game. Finnerty's time in the NFL was over.
The entrance to the Bray Creek campgrounds. This is near the area where Finnerty's boat was recovered on Sunday. He had been fishing in the Baldwin River and made a cell phone call to his wife saying that he was nervous and afraid. That was the last time anyone heard from him.
Finnerty's football career was over, and he welcomed the new chapter of his life. A wife, kids, a new job, a new beginning. It was the end of a Memorial Day trip to Baldwin, Michigan. Finnerty wanted to go out one last time to the lake before the family had to head back. Alone, Finnerty sat pole in hand in complete tranquility.
Hello?
Finnerty ran through the woods, in a state of fear and paranoia as he tracked through the woods' uneven terrain. He ran into 2 men at the lake, and they were now after him. Fearing for his life, he made 2 frantic phone calls. The first to his wife, stating how he had seen 2 men at the river who were now after him. During the conversation, Finnerty began to call out, "Hey, are you there?" to the men that were closing in behind him. She began to hear rustling noises on the other end of the line and asked her husband what he was doing. Finnerty told his wife that he was taking off his clothes. She told him to stay put, and the call was disconnected. A second call was then placed to his brother-in-law. He complained of the 2 men that continued to follow him, and stating, "I don't know where I am."
The search continues for a former Grand Valley State University quarterback. He hasn't been heard from since Sunday evening.
He was last seen about 8:30 that night when his family dropped him off at the Baldwin River.
A ping on his cell phone prompted an all-out search over the past 2 days. A busload of current and former players and coaches assisted in the search today, hoping to find him alive. Now, the sheriff says that they're treating this area as a crime scene.
2 days had passed, and Finnerty was still nowhere to be found. It was the final search of the day, and as they traveled through the unsteady terrain, littered with frantic footprints, they found what they had feared most. They discovered Finnerty, face down and arms spread, less than a half-mile away from where he had gone missing, and less than 100 yards away from the main road. Finnerty was dead.
Tragic news to report tonight. The body of former GVSU standout quarterback Cullen Finnerty has been found.
A sad ending to the search for a missing former college football star quarterback from Michigan. The body of 30-year-old Cullen Finnerty has been recovered in a lake not far from a cabin his family owns.
Say an autopsy will be needed to determine why a former college football star has been found dead.
Cause of death unknown. That's the first finding in an autopsy of former superstar GVSU quarterback Cullen Finnerty.
The mysterious nature and circumstances of Finnerty's death stunned many, and an investigation soon began. An autopsy report on Finnerty found a slightly enlarged heart and slightly cloudy lungs, but no trauma to the body at all. According to a report prepared by a Lake County Sheriff's deputy, there was no indication of foul play, no bruises, and no cuts. In the days prior to his disappearance and death, he complained of having headaches and difficulty sleeping. But what about the phone calls? And the men who were following Finnerty through the woods? Finnerty was in Detroit with coworkers, and while on his way home, he saw a car in his rearview mirror, tailing him close behind. Panicked, he passed his home and continued driving 150 miles to Grand Rapids in western Michigan, arriving at his brother Tim's home in a state of sheer panic, believing that the FBI was following him. According to his wife, Finnerty was in a state of panic for 3 to 5 days. What then happened in the woods that night? Were there indeed men following Finnerty, or was this all in his head? According to medical examiners and the updated autopsy, this is what occurred. Finnerty's initial paranoia was sparked by being alone in the woods while waiting for his in-laws to pick him up. And this paranoia and eventual disorientation were exacerbated by 2 factors: an elevated level of oxycodone in his system, a powerful painkiller, and the discovery that Finnerty had stage 2 CTE.
Finnerty was a star on the field for the Lakers, but his wife says football is what led to his early death.
CTE is found in people with a history of head trauma and can only be officially diagnosed when a person is dead. The patient is often aggressive, explosive, or paranoid.
The autopsy showed he was living with CTE, a degenerative brain disorder associated with concussions.
Terrifying last moments and how his football career may have played a major role in this.
Medical examiner says Finnerty was on the pain medication oxycodone, likely prescribed for back injuries suffered during his football career. His brain was studied by medical experts at Boston University, and it was determined that he suffered a degenerative brain disease known as CTE, which is found in athletes with repeated head trauma.
This combination led to his extreme paranoia and disorientation, and as Finnerty traversed the terrain, he began to vomit and died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit after he became disoriented.
New this morning, Cullen Finnerty's wife is part of a wrongful death lawsuit against the NCAA.
But his wife says football is what led to his early death, and she believes the NCAA should pay.
After the discovery that the CTE contributed to Cullen Finnerty's early death, his wife Jennifer joined a lawsuit against the NCAA, saying the association did not properly protect college athletes and warned them about the risks of head injuries while playing football. The jury, however, voted that the NCAA was not liable in the death of Cullen Finnerty, stating that Finnerty's death was caused by other health problems and addictions, which Finnerty did have and went to rehab for a year before his death. Finnerty is survived by his wife and 2 daughters. Finnerty was 30 years old.
Jackie Wallace, the former U of A football star, who's now missing. It is the latest chapter in the story of Wallace's battle with addiction that started after he left football.
Jackie Wallace, once considered a football great, Super Bowl winner and hometown hero.
Jackie Wallace was on top of the world as an NFL quarterback.
The Minnesota Vikings drafted him, and in 6 NFL seasons, he played in 2 Super Bowls.
But soon his life took a series of unexpected turns.
But it was after his football career, when the roar of crowds faded, that his demons took control.
Jackie spiraled into deep depression and soon found himself unable to escape the grip of drugs and alcohol.
He didn't answer the door. Got the text message back from him where I simply asked, are you okay? And he just said no.
Today, Wallace is still missing.
Steelers line up with Stallworth to the left and Swan flanking to the right. The running backs are Harris and Blyer. Here's a fake to Blyer. And Bradshaw's looking and throwing, trying to get the bomb down to Stallworth. And it is broken up at the Minnesota 37-yard line. Covering the play beautifully, Jackie Wallace with one hand.
Jackie Wallace, the former U of A football star, who's now missing. Today, Wallace is still missing.
But by 1990, the New Orleans star football player with 2 Super Bowl rings had dropped off the map. Nobody seemed to know where he was.
And eventually disappeared.
Drafted in the second round of the 1973 NFL Draft, Wallace had left his mark at the University of Arizona, garnering 19 interceptions in his junior and senior years. And by his second year, he had earned a spot in the starting lineup, and a nickname that suited his playing style, the Headhunter. Standing 6 feet 3 inches, Wallace was physical and light on his feet.
To the 50 and the 40 out of territory, 45-40, 35-30, Jackie Wallace 25-20. To the 40.
The Rose Bowl is packed. Not an empty seat anywhere. And we are indeed down to 2 survivors, the Pittsburgh Steelers.
The atmosphere was electric. The only man perhaps more charged was Jackie Wallace as he made his way to the field. The screams of thousands of fans reverberated throughout the stadium. However, the game would not go as he would have hoped. I had practiced all week with the nickel defense, he said, but when the situations came up, they didn't put me in. By halftime, the game was 13-10, Rams leading the Steelers. But that would soon change. The Steelers would take the lead and would never look back, winning the game 31-19.
And the Steelers then, victorious in Super Bowl 14.
The MVP was Terry Bradshaw. Terry Bradshaw, right.
An enraged Wallace entered the locker room and began to berate his coach in front of the team, telling him he could just kiss his
went missing. Vanished without a trace as the mystery around his disappearance deepens.
Journalist Ted Jackson roamed the New Orleans streets, searching for his next story. He had been told by his editor of a homeless camp beneath an interstate overpass. Intrigued, Jackson decided to investigate. But when he arrived, he found it destroyed. And as he was beginning to leave, a sleeping homeless man caught his attention. Jackson snapped a few photos of the unknown man and awoke him to find out what had happened to the camp. The man stated that there had been a shooting and all of the men had fled in panic. And as Jackson got up to leave, the man said, "You ought to do a story about me." "And why would I want to do that?" Jackson replied. "Because," he said, "I've played in 3 Super Bowls."
Bradshaw throwing to the far side, and it is broken up at the goal line by Jackie Wallace on a pass intended for left flat to Stallworth, and Stallworth is nailed. Going nowhere on the play, Jackie Wallace there to get him. No protection for him that time, as Wallace, who has played a tremendously effective defensive game this afternoon. And
but the throes of addiction and depression would cause his life to descend into chaos. Three years later, Wallace would get married, and would remain married for over 10 years.
We're sorry, you have reached a number that has been disconnected or is no longer in service.
In 2002, Wallace, after a dispute with his wife, would again disappear without a trace. Over 12 years would pass. In 2014, Wallace would be found after a near-suicide attempt. In 2017, Wallace would turn 3 years sober, but would relapse that same year. Wallace would regain sobriety in 2018, and in 2020, journalist Ted Jackson, who had found him sleeping under a bridge in 1990, would write a book about Wallace titled, "You Ought to Do a Story About Me," which documents his struggles with addiction and his constant pursuit of redemption.
A fishing trip that turned deadly for 4 friends when their boat capsized off of Florida's west coast.
Florida, the Coast Guard, equipped with 2 Air Force helicopters, continued to search Sunday for a fishing boat carrying a pair of NFL players.
Top story tonight, the continuing desperate efforts to save lives. We begin with the search that continues.
Searching for the 4 men since they were reported missing early Sunday morning. That's when a relative of one of the men reported them missing. Oakland Raiders linebacker Marquise Cooper owns the missing boat. Cooper, Corey Smith.
2 guys are missing, 2 NFL players. I'm a little blown away by this story.
The St. Petersburg Times, Schuyler told the Coast Guard NFL players Marquise Cooper and Corey Smith gave up hope, took off their life vests, and drifted away. When their 21-foot boat capsized in the choppy waters of the Gulf of Mexico Saturday night, none of the 4 men on board was wearing a life vest. Hypothermia could have made Cooper and Smith irrational enough to remove their life vest.
When hypothermia sets in, it does things to the mind and the body that, neither anyone can control.
On February 28th, 4 friends, NFL linebacker Marquise Cooper, a 3rd-round draft pick in 2004 and a 5-year NFL veteran, NFL defensive end Corey Smith, a 6-year NFL veteran and Super Bowl champion, and UCF players Nick Schuyler and Will Bleakley decided to go offshore fishing. Cooper, being an avid fisherman, was no stranger to Florida waters and was ready to have a great day with friends. But a casual day out in the water would soon become a nightmare.
The search continues for 3 men missing from a weekend fishing trip off the coast of Florida.
Friends who left for a deep-sea fishing trip Saturday morning out of these docks still haven't been found despite a search throughout one of the coldest nights this season.
The Coast Guard is focusing on a small area 35 miles from Florida's west coast.
Say that because the 3 others are current or recent football players, their chances of survival are a bit greater, as they should be able to fight off hypothermia longer than the average person. Still, they say they have no time to lose.
On March 2nd, at 1:30 p.m., the boat was found, capsized, with Schuyler clinging to the engine mount.
Schuyler, one of the 4 who were out on this trip.
What happened to the other 3 men, including those 2 NFL football players?
Miraculously, he had survived. But the other 3 members of the group were nowhere to be found. The story Schuyler had to tell about what happened during those days out in the water can only be described as absolutely horrifying.
Really rough. It was cold, it was rough, and I got sick. Started to lose some motor functions.
At one point you said he started mumbling and you noticed he's foaming at the mouth. So he's hallucinating and is really is losing his mind.
February 28th, 5:30 p.m. The day was over, and as the group got ready to head back to port, they attempted to pull up the anchor, but were unable to do so. Bleakley then suggested tying it to the transom and utilizing the motor to help pull the anchor loose. Seeing this as their best option, Cooper decided to test out Bleakley's theory and thrust it forward. The result was disastrous. The boat capsized, throwing all 4 men into the deep and vast ocean. All 4 men instinctually swam back to the overturned vessel, attempting to turn it back over, but to no avail. They did, however, manage to retrieve 4 flotation devices that would be critical for their survival. The 4 men struggled to stay on top of the hull in the rough Gulf waters. The water level was up to their chests as they struggled to stay on the hull. And as the hours passed and the skies darkened and the water froze over, it began to take its effect on the men. At approximately 2:30 a.m., Cooper began to become very quiet, not responding or delivering delayed responses to his friends as they struggled to keep him awake and alert. As the hours passed, Cooper's condition worsened. He began to mumble, hallucinate, and foam at the mouth. Cooper, disoriented, began trying to take off his life jacket and swim away from the boat. His friends desperately tried to hold him down, and after an hour, he stopped fighting and became unresponsive. They flipped Cooper over and began to perform CPR. At around the same time, Corey Smith began to exhibit similar symptoms and began to try and get away from his friends and away from the boat. Skylar had to make a decision and let the unresponsive Cooper go. And he drifted away, slowly sinking into the ocean. Smith's condition continued to worsen, and he became very aggressive and began to scream, yelling, "I'm gonna kill you." Smith finally broke away and ripped off his jacket and dove into the ocean, never to be seen again. Now, only 2 of the 4 men were left, clinging to the capsized vessel. Nick Schuyler and Will Bleakley, best friends who had met each other in the 6th grade, now in a desperate fight for their lives. As the water rose and the waves became more violent, Will turned to Nick and stated, "I don't think I'm gonna make it another night." And by 5 p.m. Sunday, Will began to exhibit similar symptoms that Cooper and Smith had. The waves reached 15 feet. Will began to slur his words and foam at the mouth. And among the crashing of waves, he emerged non-responsive. Skylar clung to him, but it was too late. And as he let Will go, he drifted out into the sea. And he did not sink like the others. Rather, he floated away for nearly 10 minutes as Skylar sat on top of the hull, awaiting his fate. He pleaded to the heavens, asking his now fallen friends for help. 6 hours would pass. Skylar began to hallucinate. Hope seemed to be lost.
Skylar, one of the 4 who were out on this trip, Nick being one of the South Florida players.
1 survivor was found alive.
Finding fellow passenger Nick Schuyler alive Monday gave their families new hope. Rescuers pulled Schuyler to safety after 2 harrowing nights in the open water. At one point, fighting 14-foot seas, he alone was able to hang on.
Her friends had been on a deep-sea fishing trip Saturday. The Coast Guard spotted Schuyler Monday, shivering and dehydrated.
But I think he's extremely fortunate, having been in the water for 46, 47 hours, and that he's even alive.
Right there.
The Coast Guard found 1 life vest from the boat, but no sign of the other 3 men.
Nick was the only one to come back alive. He was found bobbing in the water 3 days after one of the biggest searches in Coast Guard history.
Arrived on scene early this morning, found the overturned boat that we were looking for with 1 person on board clinging to the boat. That person was Mr. Nick Schuyler.
In 2009, during the Raiders and Eagles game, a pigeon descended onto the field during a special teams play, with many on the Raiders sideline believing it was the spirit of Cooper joining the team for one last play. Corey Smith was named the 2009 recipient of the Detroit Lions Media-Friendly Good Guy Award. The 3 men that lost their lives in the 43-hour battle for survival will never be forgotten. Marquise Cooper was 27 years old and is survived by his wife and daughter. Corey Smith's number 93, was retired by the Detroit Lions for the 2009 season, and his family set up a foundation in his honor. He was 29 years old. Will Bleakley was 25 years old and is lovingly remembered by his friends and family.
Two University of Rochester students abducted.
Two students who police say were forcibly abducted and held against their wills.
That both play on the University of Rochester's football team.
Unimaginable horror. Two college students held captive and tortured by masked men.
It feels like a scene from a horror movie.
I sat down on this couch in the living room, and next thing I knew is just the lights went out and about 5 to 10 men in just masks.
Tied up, terrorized, and beaten for 40 hours, and the question remains, why?
Nicholas Kollias and Ani Okiki'u were reported missing Saturday evening.
For the next 40-plus hours, Kollias and his teammate were repeatedly beaten and tortured.
I'm in this.
You in this?
Video?
There's a video.
You recording, homie?
I'm recording.
The masked men then started recording this cell phone video.
Of guns and knives and bats and chainsaws.
Police have said the students were abducted in a targeted attack.
Torture.
They were gloating.
He ain't got nothing to do with it. He just started running. Yo, get your boy.
Reasoning behind it led to more disturbing revelations.
Please. I'll do anything.
Nicholas Kollias and Ani Okiki'iwu were teammates, football players for the University of Rochester. Kollias, a defensive end who played mainly on special teams, and Iwu, a starting cornerback. During the course of the night, Iwu told Kollias about these two girls that wanted to meet up with them. And soon enough, they were headed back to the house with the two women, Samantha and Leah, where they believed a party would be taking place. But there was no party. An eerie silence emanated from the home. The two women led Kollias and Iwu through the side of the home. Seated on a leather couch, Kollias tried to make himself comfortable, when out of nowhere, the lights shut off. Out of the darkness, 5 to 10 masked men emerged, carrying bats, knives, and guns.
A bizarre situation. Two 21-year-old students upstate at the University of Rochester were abducted.
The two went missing early Saturday.
Ani Okiki'iwu and Nicholas Kollias were taken Saturday night from their New York State campus.
They were last seen at 2 Saturday morning and reported missing that night.
In a state of panic, Kollias made a run for it, making it about halfway before one of the masked men fired his rifle, hitting Kollias in the leg and shattering his femur. Unbelievably, he stood up once more and tried to pull the door open, but the two women were holding it shut. He was then struck violently with a bat to the head, knocking him to the ground. Kollias and Iwu were then dragged to the bathroom, where they duct taped their hands and legs. Soon afterward, a chilling video would be taken by the masked men.
I'm in this.
You in this?
Video?
There's a video.
You recording, homie?
I'm recording.
The masked men then started recording this cell phone video.
This gonna do when they take 4 pounds from me. This right here.
Of their attack.
You run with the please. I'll do anything.
And I didn't know what was going on. I was so confused.
He ain't got nothing to do with it. He just started running.
Kollias and Iwu would be physically, sexually, and psychologically tortured for 40 hours. Gun to his head, Kollias was forced to call his bank and ask that all available money be transferred so that it can be withdrawn. With pieces of glass from hours of torture in his skull and pieces lodged in his eardrum, Kollias made the call.
I really need the money now, so there's no way that I could get the $1,500 just transferred over to the debit card.
It's impossible to move money on the weekend.
Okay, that's fine. I guess I'll just call back one minute.
The two teammates were reported as missing after not returning the previous night, and the police would soon start closing in. The police saw thousands of dollars being withdrawn from Kollias' bank accounts. They had interviewed Samantha and Leah, but they proved elusive and suspicious during questioning, and were brought in once more. An interrogation that would end up lasting more than 14 hours. And during the final hours, Samantha and Leah began to crack, revealing 2 locations in which the 2 teammates could be found. It had been nearly 40 hours since they were ambushed. "40 hours since the torment began." The masked men marched in furiously and began to crank up the music. Kollias' cards had stopped working, and they began pressing their guns against the 2 teammates' heads and firing rounds at walls around the flailing victims. Their time was running out. The police had found the home and prepared to breach. Police arrested 2 of the masked men and quickly found Kollias and Iwu badly injured. I've been around a long time. I've seen a lot of things. This one is really in a class by itself in terms of the level of physical and psychological torture. It was as bad as a horror movie. Both teammates were immediately taken to the hospital. "I had 3 or 4 blood transfusions," Kollias says. "They put a titanium rod through my femur, attaching it with screws in my knee and hip. They surgically removed glass from my eardrum and scalp and skull. Soon, all 9 of the assailants were arrested, including Samantha and Leah, the 2 women who lured them in. But one question remained. Why was Kollias and Iwu targeted? The star linebacker for the University of Rochester, Isaiah Smith, would be at the very center of the story. Smith walked to a student apartment complex to meet up with 3 unknown men. Shortly after, a black sedan is seen pulling into the parking lot. 4 men exit the vehicle and follow Smith into the complex. They entered what they believed to be Smith's room and put on the table 4 pounds of marijuana. Smith had a reputation as the campus drug dealer. Then, all of a sudden, 3 men charged in and attacked the men with pepper spray and a hammer, striking them violently and taking the marijuana. Smith had orchestrated the attack. The ambush and torture of Kollias and Iwu was a retaliatory attack. But was also a case of mistaken identity. They believed that Iwu was Isaiah Smith. Smith had used Iwu's apartment to conduct the drug deal, which led to Iwu's abduction, while Kollias just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. 3 of the 4 men in the recording were sentenced to 35 years in prison. Samantha and Leah were both sentenced to 7 years in prison, while Lydell Strickland, the ringleader, was sentenced to 155 years in prison. Isaiah Smith was sentenced to 14 years in prison, convicted of robbery and burglary. The horrors that occurred on 22 Harvest Street continue to shock many to this day. A story of cruelty, survival, and justice.
I'll show you the 6 people who've now been arrested in connection to the kidnapping of these 2 students.
The 2 women who lured Nico and his teammate to 22 Harvest Street were each sentenced to more than a dozen years in prison after agreeing to testify against the attackers. All of the men in the cell phone video also went to prison for Nico's kidnapping and torture, including Lydell Strickland, who laughed when a judge sentenced him to 155 years.